Welcome in, everyone, to our deep dive today. And we're going to be taking a look at Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation.
Oh, yeah, a great pick.
It's one that really delves into, this whole question of, we keep hearing about this rise of anxiety and depression
Mm-hmm.
among young people.
Mm-hmm.
And he really takes a look at it from a pretty broad perspective. So,
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about his approach is he puts it in the context of modern psychology and, all these cultural shifts that have been happening.
right. So it's not just looking at, brain chemistry in isolation.
Right.
It's looking at how, all these bigger societal changes are impacting, whole generations.
Mm-hmm.
And Gen Z in particular seems to be, right at the
Yeah.
forefront of all this.
Yeah, they're the canaries in the coal mine, I guess you could say.
So where does he start with all of this? What's kind of his central argument?
Well, he introduces this idea of the great rewiring of childhood. And his argument is that the rise of smartphones and social media has basically fundamentally changed how kids experience childhood.
Right. It's like we've gone from a world of, free play and exploration to a world where kids are, constantly plugged in, interacting more with screens than with each other.
Right, and he makes this really thought-provoking analogy. Have you ever heard of the Mars analogy?
Oh, yeah. The Mars analogy.
It's wild. It's basically like if we sent our kids to colonize Mars knowing that it was going to, permanently change their physiology,
Right.
like their bodies would adapt to that environment.
It's a very powerful way to think about it.
Yeah, and he uses that to illustrate how growing up immersed in this digital world is kind of like growing up on a different planet.
And that we don't fully understand the long-term consequences of that yet.
Exactly. We're all part of this big experiment.
Right. And I think what's interesting, too, is how Haidt brings in his own, journey into setting this topic.
Oh, yeah.
He talks about, his previous work on the coddling of the American mind.
Right.
And how his observations of changes on college campuses, really sparked his interest in this whole area of adolescent mental health.
Mm-hmm. It gives it personal touch.
Yeah, it does. But he doesn't just rely on anecdotes or personal observations.
No.
He really dives into the data.
He does. He shows these really stark statistics about this, sharp increase in reported rates of depression and anxiety among teens. And it really starts to tick up around 2012.
Right, when smartphones and social media became ubiquitous.
Exactly. So the timing's pretty compelling.
Yeah, and he's not naive
No.
about, the potential skepticism around self-reported data.
Of course not.
But he explores other explanations, and ultimately, he finds that the timing and the global nature of this trend points to something really significant happening.
I mean, the fact that it's happening everywhere suggests it's not just a fluke or a fad.
Right, and it's not just about a general increase in mental health issues.
Oh.
He specifically focuses on what are called internalizing disorders.
Mm-hmm.
So things like anxiety, depression.
Right, those things that are closely linked to social relationships and how connected we feel.
Exactly, and that's where I found it really interesting that he connects this rise in internalizing disorders to the decline of free play.
That's a key part of his argument. It's fascinating. He makes this analogy about how, trees need wind to develop strong roots.
Oh, wow, I like that.
And he says that kids need a similar kind of exposure to risk and challenge to develop resilience.
So it's like when we overprotect kids and shield them from every little bump and bruise,
Yeah.
we're actually making them more vulnerable in the long run.
We're stunting their emotional growth.
Yeah, and he introduces these two modes of being, discover mode and defend mode.
I love that.
And it's so true, right? Like when you think about it,
Explain it.
it's like play, especially unsupervised play, really helps kids develop that discover mode, that openness to explore, to learn from their mistakes.
But when we hover over them and prevent them from even experiencing minor setbacks, it's like we're pushing them into defend mode.
Right? That fear, anxiety, that reluctance to try new things.
And he ties this back to the rise of what he calls safetyism.
Which is this idea that we need to protect kids from every possible risk.
Every possible risk, even if it means, limiting their freedom and independence.
And it's not just about physical safety either.
No.
It's also about this emotional safety, this idea that we need to shield kids from any kind of discomfort or unpleasantness.
Right, which ironically makes them less equipped to deal with life.
Exactly.
Yep.
So we've got this, this great rewiring happening, this decline in free play, this, this culture of safetyism. Where does social media fit into all of this?
Well, he really dives into the nuances of how social media impacts young people.
Oh,
And he specifically looks at the different ways it affects girls versus boys.
right. So he's not just saying social media is bad, full stop.
No, not at all.
Hmm.
He's breaking it down, looking at the specific mechanisms at play.
Okay, so what's he finding?
Well, he finds that both genders experience, negative consequences from social media use. But girls seem to be particularly vulnerable to those pressures of social comparison, cyberbullying, and those unrealistic beauty standards that are often perpetuated online.
Right. So for girls, it's like this constant feeling of not being good enough,
Hmm.
not being pretty enough.
Not having no followers or likes.
Yeah, and all that feeds directly into, those internalizing disorders we talked about, the anxiety, the depression, the low self-esteem.
And he connects this to psychological research on communion strivings versus agency strivings. Have you heard of that?
Oh, break that down for me. What are communion strivings and agency striving?
Okay, so communion strivings are about connection and belonging, being part of a group.
Okay.
And agency strivings are more about independence and competence, having control over your own life.
So girls are more driven by communion strivings and boys are more driven by agency strivings.
Generally speaking, yes. And the problem is that social media offers this sort of false sense of communion for girls.
Oh, interesting.
It gives them the illusion of connection.
But it actually ends up making them feel more isolated and lonely.
Often, yeah.
Oh.
Because those online interactions can be really superficial.
Right. They lack that depth and intimacy of real-world relationships.
Exactly. And it's interesting how he contrasts this with how boys tend to engage with technology.
Okay, so how do boys fit into this picture?
Well, for boys, it's less about social comparison and more about seeking that sense of agency and control that we talked about.
And that's where video games come in.
Right. Video games, especially those that involve, competition and problem solving, can fulfill those agency strivings for boys.
So they get that sense of mastery and achievement.
Exactly. But the downside is that, excessive gaming can lead to social isolation and, difficulty navigating the real world.
So again, it's about finding that balance.
Right. And what Haidt points out is that despite these different online experiences,
Okay.
both boys and girls are ending up in a similar place, feeling lonelier, less connected to something meaningful, and, struggling with those mental health challenges.
So different paths, same destination?
Exactly. And this is where Haidt takes a really interesting turn. He starts framing this whole issue as a form of spiritual degradation.
Spiritual degradation.
Yeah.
That's a strong term.
Yeah.
What exactly does he mean by that?
Yeah, it is. It's a provocative term. But what he's getting at is that, this phone-based life, a life that's so dominated by screens and, virtual interactions, it can make it really hard to connect with anything larger than ourselves.
Right. He's talking about that sense of meaning and purpose, something that kind of transcends our own little individual needs and desires.
Exactly. And he draws on Emil Durkheim's concept of the sacred versus the profane.
Okay.
Durkheim argued that life kind of moves between these two realms.
Okay.
The sacred is associated with, rituals, shared experiences, that sense of awe and wonder, a feeling of belonging to something bigger than ourselves.
And the profane is kind of like the everyday, the mundane, the realm of individual needs and desires.
Yeah. Right. And Haidt's argument is that the virtual world as it currently exists is almost entirely profane.
Interesting.
It lacks those grounding elements that, help us transcend our own little egos and connect to something larger.
He actually connects this to the way our brains work, right?
Yes.
He talks about the default mode network, or DMN.
Hmm.
What is that exactly? And how does it relate to this idea of the sacred and the profane?
So the default mode network is a network of brain regions that becomes active when we're not focused on a specific task,
Okay.
when our minds are kind of wandering.
Okay.
And research has shown that the DMN becomes quieter during moments of awe and self-transcendence.
Oh, wow. So like those experiences that Durkheim associated with the sacred.
Exactly.
So when we're caught up in the, everyday world, our DMN is highly active. But when we have these moments of connection to something larger, it quiets down.
Precisely. And the problem is that social media, with its constant stream of notifications and comparisons and, self-promotion, it keeps the DMN highly active.
So it's reinforcing that self-focus.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's preventing us from experiencing those moments of, quiet contemplation and connection
Right.
that are so essential for our well-being.
It's like our brains are being wired for distraction, for, constant external stimulation rather than for those deeper, more meaningful experiences.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real shift.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture here.
We have.
This great rewiring, the decline of play, the rise of safetyism, the negative impacts of social media, this sense of spiritual emptiness. It can feel a little overwhelming, but Haidt doesn't leave us there, right?
No, he doesn't. He offers some solutions,
Okay.
ways to address these challenges. And I appreciate about his approach is that he's a pragmatist.
Cool.
He doesn't just throw out, vague ideas. He proposes concrete actions that can be taken at different levels.
Like
By governments, by tech companies, by schools, by parents.
Okay, let's start with the tech companies. They're the ones who've created these platforms, these technologies that are having such a profound impact on young people.
Yeah.
What does Haidt suggest they do?
Well, he starts with a pretty bold proposition.
Okay.
He says that we need to start treating tech companies like we treat other industries that impact public health.
Like
the food industry or the automobile industry.
Okay, so we're talking regulations, holding them accountable
Exactly.
for the impact their products have, especially on young users.
Precisely because right now, he argues, these companies are caught in what he calls a race to the bottom of the brainstem.
Oh, wow.
They're competing for our attention using every psychological trick in the book to keep us hooked regardless of the long-term consequences.
And those consequences, as we've discussed, can be, pretty severe, especially for kids and teens whose brains are still developing.
Exactly. So Haidt proposes this idea of a duty of care, where tech companies would be legally obligated to design their platforms with the well-being of young users in mind.
That sounds good in theory, but how would that actually work in practice?
Well, he points to some real-world examples, like the age-appropriate design code that was implemented in the UK.
Okay.
It basically sets standards for tech companies to protect children's privacy, limit addictive features, and, generally make the online world a safer place for kids.
So if a company violates those standards, they face penalties, fines, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It creates real consequences for prioritizing profit over the well-being of users.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What else? What else does he suggest?
Another concrete measure he advocates for is age verification.
Okay.
He argues that right now it's far too easy for kids to lie about their age and access platforms that, they're not developmentally ready for.
I know this is a huge issue for parents.
It is.
It's like this constant cat and mouse game trying to keep up with all the latest apps and platforms and making sure that your kid isn't, accessing things that they shouldn't be. So how would age verification work?
He proposes a system where a child's device is marked as belonging to a minor, and companies would be required to verify age before granting access to, platforms with age restrictions.
So it kind of takes the burden off the parents and puts the responsibility on the tech companies to enforce these rules.
Right, and he argues that this is a much more effective approach because, let's face it, parents can't possibly monitor everything their kids are doing online.
That's true. It's like trying to plug all the holes in a leaky boat. There's always going to be another one popping up.
Exactly. And he also points out that many of these platforms are designed to be addictive.
Right.
They use sophisticated algorithms to keep users engaged.
It's like they're hijacking our brain's reward system.
Yeah.
Making it harder and harder for us to resist those notifications and those endless scrolls through social media feeds.
Exactly. And that's why he believes that regulation is necessary. We can't rely on individual willpower to overcome these sophisticated persuasive techniques that are being used against us.
Okay, so we've talked about what tech companies can do. What about governments? What role do they play in addressing this mental health crisis?
Well, he argues that governments often contribute to the problem.
Really?
By promoting what he calls safetyism.
Right, we talked about that earlier, this idea that we need to protect kids from every possible risk.
Exactly, even if it means limiting their freedom and independence.
And he points to outdated child neglect laws.
He does.
That often penalize parents for giving their kids reasonable independence.
Yeah, and he advocates for what he calls reasonable childhood independence laws.
Okay.
That would clarify what constitutes neglect.
Okay.
And protect parents who allow their children age-appropriate freedom.
So it's about shifting the cultural mindset from fear to trust.
Yeah.
From seeing the world as inherently dangerous to seeing it as, an opportunity for growth.
That's a great way to put it. And he suggests that governments can also invest in programs that encourage real-world engagement.
So things like
gap years, national service, or even just creating more public spaces where kids can gather and play freely.
It's about providing alternatives to the screen-based world.
Exactly.
Giving kids opportunities to connect with each other in real life. to experience the joy of movement and play, to develop those social and emotional skills that are so essential for their well-being.
Right, and he emphasizes that it's not just about limiting screen time. It's about creating a world where kids have other options, other things that engage them and bring them joy.
So we've covered tech companies, we've covered governments.
Right.
What about schools?
Yes.
They play a huge role in shaping young people's lives.
Mhm.
What role do they play in this? And what can they do to create a healthier environment for students?
Haidt has some pretty strong opinions about what schools should be doing. He's a big proponent of phone-free schools.
Not just limiting phone use, but completely removing them from the school environment.
Exactly. He argues that phones have a major distraction in the classroom,
Okay.
and they contribute to social comparison and anxiety among students.
I can see how that would be
Oh,
controversial.
absolutely.
But I also see the logic behind it. It's about creating a space where kids can focus on learning and interacting with each other without the constant distraction of their phones.
Exactly. He cites examples of schools that have successfully implemented phone-free policies, and they've seen improvements in academic performance, social interaction, overall well-being.
So it's not just a theoretical idea, it's actually happening out there in the real world. What else does he suggest schools do?
Well, he also encourages schools to expand opportunities for unstructured play, particularly during recess.
So recess is not just a break from learning.
No, he sees it as an essential part of learning.
Right, it's a chance for kids to move their bodies,
Yeah.
to socialize, to use their imaginations, to develop those essential skills that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And to further encourage independence and responsibility, he recommends something called the Let Grow Project.
What is that?
It's a program where schools assign homework that involves kids doing something on their own that they've never done before, like walking the dog, running an errand, something that builds confidence and a sense of agency.
I love that idea. It's like a structured way to gently push kids out of their comfort zones and into that discover mode we were talking about earlier.
And for older students, he stresses the importance of re-engaging boys who seem to be falling behind in academic achievement and overall well-being.
Right. We touched on this earlier, how boys are often drawn to the virtual world, seeking that sense of agency that they may be lacking in the real world.
Exactly. And he echoes Richard Reeves's arguments for more vocational training, career and technical education, and even hiring more male teachers to provide positive role models for boys who may be struggling.
It's about meeting boys where they are,
Yeah.
providing them with opportunities that align with their strengths and interests,
Right.
rather than trying to force them into, a one-size-fits-all educational model.
Exactly. And to really understand what works, he calls for a nationwide experiment
Yeah.
to test the effectiveness of these various interventions.
That would be incredible. Imagine the data we could gather,
It would be groundbreaking.
the insights we could gain into what truly works to create a healthier and more supportive environment for young people.
It would provide evidence-based guidance for schools, policymakers, and parents alike.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Tech companies, governments, schools. But what about us?
Yeah.
What about parents? I mean, we're on the front lines navigating this complex digital landscape with our kids every day. What specific advice does Haidt offer for parents who are, trying to raise resilient, well-adjusted kids in this challenging world?
He uses this really interesting metaphor. He talks about parents as being gardeners rather than carpenters.
Okay.
So it's more about creating a space where your children can thrive
Right.
rather than, trying to mold them into some predetermined shape.
That's a lovely analogy. So what are the key principles of good gardening in this context? What does he suggest parents focus on?
Well, he really emphasizes the importance of prioritizing free play.
Giving kids those long, unstructured hours of play that we often reminisce about from our own childhoods.
Exactly. It's about fostering independence, creativity, and that essential ability to navigate risk and challenge.
Which is so crucial for building resilience, as we discussed earlier.
Right. And when it comes to those inevitable screen time battles.
Oh, yeah, because let's face it, almost every parent struggles with this. So what does he suggest?
He stresses the importance of setting clear limits, designating no device zones, being mindful of the behaviors we model as adults,
Right.
and of course, delaying smartphones and social media accounts for as long as possible.
All of that makes sense, but it's easier said than done right.
It is.
There's so much pressure from peers, from society, even from our kids themselves to give in to those demands for, the latest gadgets and apps.
Yeah, it's tough. But he reminds us that, our actions as individual parents contribute to a larger collective effort. When more parents push back against those pressures, when we set different norms, it becomes easier for everyone.
It's like a ripple effect,
Exactly.
changing the culture one family at a time.
And he also emphasizes the power of connecting with other like-minded parents,
Yeah,
forming communities that support each other in this endeavor.
it's about finding strength in numbers, knowing that you're not alone in this struggle.
Absolutely. And he also encourages parents to focus on building their children's inner resources,
Ah.
cultivating their strengths and fostering a sense of meaning and purpose beyond the virtual world.
Helping them find activities and passions that truly engage them,
Yes.
that give them a sense of accomplishment and belonging.
Exactly. It's about nurturing their whole selves, not just their online personas.
One thing that really struck me about Haidt's book is that he doesn't just focus on the problems.
Right.
He offers a sense of hope, a belief that we can actually turn things around.
I agree. He's not just a critic, he's a problem solver. And he presents a roadmap for creating a healthier and more balanced world for young people.
And he doesn't shy away from the complexity of the issue either. He acknowledges that, anxiety and depression have likely been rising for decades, but that something shifted dramatically in the early 2010s.
It's like all these trends kind of converge, declining social capital, rising economic inequality, political polarization, and then this sudden explosion of smartphones and social media, right when a generation of young people is entering that crucial period of brain development.
It's almost like a perfect storm.
It really is.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that complexity because it's not about placing blame on any one factor, but rather understanding the interplay of forces that are shaping our experience.
Yeah, it's about seeing the whole picture so that we can make informed choices about how to intervene effectively.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground, the potential causes, the proposed solutions. But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear your final thoughts. What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive?
If I had to choose one takeaway, it would be this. The challenges facing young people today are complex and multifaceted, but they are not insurmountable. We have the power to make a difference both individually and collectively by creating a world that prioritizes connection, meaning, and well-being over distraction, comparison, and instant gratification.
Beautifully put.
Wow.
And for me, the image that sticks with me is Haidt's analogy of sending our children to Mars.
Oh, yeah.
It's a reminder that we are shaping the world that future generations will inherit. And we need to be mindful of the long-term consequences of our choices.
It's a powerful call to action.
It is. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation. We hope it sparks some new insights and a sense of hope that we can work together to create a brighter future for young people.
And for ourselves as well.
Absolutely. And remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going.
Until next time.